Welcome back to Wildcat Academy. Today we're going to be learning about solving quadratic equations by factoring. Before we get started, I want to go over the zero product rule. The zero product rule states that if a times b is equal to 0, then if a is 0 or b is 0, then it will solve this equation. So it will make it true. It will be a solution. So when we look at quadratic equations, one method we have to solve them is to factor them and then set these factors equal to 0. And then we can solve those equations and they will provide us the solutions. We cannot use factoring to solve quadratic equations that do not factor, or other polynomial equations. You can extend this rule on out to higher degree polynomials. Here we're starting with a factored form of a quadratic equation. It's a linear times a linear binomial, or the product of two linear binomials, which would result in a quadratic. And what we will do is we will apply the zero product rule, and I usually just make a little t chart here, or a little t table, and I will write each factor, and I will set that factor equal to 0. And then we will have two equations that we can then solve. And this first one, we will subtract 2 on both sides, and we will get x is equal to -2. So if you need to see that step, I think visually, I think it's easy to see that that will be x equals 2. And over here, we will add 4 to both sides of the equation. It will cancel on this side, and we will get a positive 4 on the right-hand side of the equation. And then we will divide by 3. And we will get x is equal to 4/3. And those are our solutions, -2 and 4/3. And for this example, I will go into a little deeper. I will go ahead and plug in and see that does provide us. So I will do that with the -2 plus 2. It's going to provide us a solution. And then 3x minus 4. And we're going to substitute in that for that x there, -2 as well. And that gives us 0 in the first parentheses, and looks like -6, -10 in the second parentheses. And you can see that it really doesn't matter what the second binomial, what it evaluated to be, because the first binomial evaluated to be 0. And 0 times -10 is 0. So we know that -2 causes this equation to be true. So therefore it is a solution. We would see the same thing if we plugged in 4/3 on the right-hand side. We would get a 0. And on the left-hand side, we would get a fraction value. But that value times 0 would still be 0. It will cause it to be true. And both solutions would check. All right, so moving on to example 2. This time we have, if we were to had started out with a quadratic, we would have started out with a two-term binomial, but it would have had a GCF, and we would have factored out the 3x. And sometimes this gives students a little bit of trouble. So I wanted to make sure I went over an example like this. And you just set the monomial equal to 0, and you can set the binomial equal to 0. And then we'll discuss this. Technically, you don't have to use the 3 at all, because you can see if I divide both sides by 3, I get x is equal to 0. To think about that, it wasn't this case, but if we had an x squared equal to 0, does not matter what degree the x is or what complicated number is out here on the left-hand side. It can be a really big number, it can be negative. That's just going to divide off into be 0. And even if it's a higher degree, when we take the root of that equation, it will still end up the square root of 0 is still 0. It just has a multiplicity equal to that indice there, or that exponent. Go ahead and get that off the screen. We're going to go back to our problem that we were working on. We will add 3 to both sides. We will get 5x is equal to 3. We will divide by 5, and we will get 3/5. And that will be our solution, 0, 3/5. Now both of these were already in factored form. Typically, when we're solving quadratics, they will not be in factored form. We will have to factor them ourselves. That will be example 3 and 4. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. And so example 3, we have a quadratic trinomial. We will want to factor that. and we will use an a times c method, and a times c is -6 and +5. It's not really necessary in this case to use this method because the leading coefficient is 1, so we can just ask ourselves what multiplies to be -6 and adds to be 5. But if you're more curious about this method, there's a link right here that you can click on that'll take you there. There's also a link in the description below. So this, like we can see, our factors end up being 1x plus 6 and 1x. This should be a -1 because that's what adds to be +5. So 1x minus 1. But whatever method you use, you'll come up with two binomials, and then we can see that we have exactly what we need in order to use the zero product rule. So we have x plus 6 is equal to 0, x minus 1 equals 0. We will solve both of these. Positive or -6 and +1. And those are our solutions. Now, occasionally you will have problems that do not start in standard form. So a quadratic that does not start in standard form, we need to go ahead and place in standard form by taking everything to one side, and sometimes we say we set it equal to 0. Well, what we're actually doing is moving everything to the left-hand side, or I guess you could say to the right-hand side. It does not really matter. Whichever keeps our leading coefficient positive is kind of what we're interested in. So our leading coefficient is already positive, so we're going to move everything to that side. And we're going to simply just subtract 2x on both sides and add 3 on both sides, and it will cancel everything on the right-hand side, and we'll end up with a 0 over there. And we will simplify this side and get 2x squared minus 5x minus 7 is equal to 0. Then we can factor that using whatever method you like. I like an a times c method just as far as an algorithm goes. Personally, I use guess and check, but I know the a times c method tends to be a good algorithm when you're first learning to factor. So we're going to divide both sides by 2. This simplifies to 1 over 1. That gives us our factors of 2x minus 7 and x plus 1. And then we just use the zero product rule. So take both of these factors, we set them equal to 0, and solve them out. And this one. And we can see our solutions are 7/2 and -1. Now, just as a note, we can go back and look at the pattern that is being formed. We can see that whatever we're looking at our factors, we can see our solutions from the actual factors. So it'll be the opposite of our constant value divided by our coefficient. So opposite of +6 is -6 divided by 1. So that gives us our solution of -6. Opposite of -1 is +1 divided by 1, which is 1. Makes a little more sense, I think, when you have a coefficient out here. So it'll be +7 divided by 2, and then -1 divided by 1. And that will always work if you have factored form. So that winds up a lesson. You can always use the zero product rule anytime a quadratic or other polynomial will factor. You just set those factors, those linear and quadratic factors, equal to 0, and those will provide the solutions. All right, and that winds up this lesson. If you enjoy the lesson, make sure to hit the like button below. If you have any questions, leave those in the comments. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the channel, and thank you for tuning in to Wildcat Academy.